Hello! The lovely Second Thought, Yugoplink, and I have started a podcast together called The Deprogram. In it, we talk about intertopics on socialism, some history stuff, current events, and memes. Join us and have a listen sometime. Links are in the description and the pinned comment. This has been a long time coming, and I honestly don't know why I haven't made this yet, but today I thought I'd make a general intro to socialism video describing the various terms and concepts at a one-on-one level. Basically, something to link to people who may be interested. We'll be pulling from various online dictionaries, like Massline, as well as several historical ideological dictionaries, such as the What is What series of Soviet academic textbooks for definitions, so they're all in one convenient little video. It's all timestamped, so feel free to jump around. With that said, let's get started. Firstly, since we're so critical of capitalism, what exactly is capitalism? Now, capitalism is a socioeconomic formation based on the ownership of the means of production by the capitalist class, and the exploitation of hired labor by capitalists through the extraction of surplus value. Other prominent features include the existence of markets, for example. The Marxist definition is really the only objective definition of capitalism, as usually the ideologues of capitalism try to define away the exploitation aspect and center in on the fact that markets exist, for example, despite the fact that markets both predate capitalism as well as have the ability to exist after capitalism to an extent. To quote Lenin, the essence of capitalism is the appropriation by individuals of the product of social labor organized by commodity economy. Hold on though, we just introduced 4 other terms: means of production, exploitation, surplus value, and of course the capital part of capitalism. Let's define those two. Now, means of production can be defined as the totality of the material elements of economic production. Alternatively, you could define it as that which is required for social reproduction, a somewhat wider definition. This includes factories, mines, machinery, tools, raw materials, land, buildings, means of transport, amongst many other things. With that said, what is exploitation? Exploitation, well, has 2 definitions. The colloquial one most people assume when hearing the word exploitation, which usually means the unjust or improper use of another person for one's own profit or advantage. That's not the Marxist definition, though. In the context of capitalism, the Marxian concept of exploitation is the expropriation, or theft, of the labor of a worker via the extraction of surplus value by the owners of the means of production, the capitalists. In essence, the capitalist gets more out of the worker than he pays for. That's the basis of profit in the sphere of production. Still, we mentioned surplus value. What is that then? Well, as already loosely defined above, surplus value is the value produced by workers in the capitalist system of production, which is over and above that which goes to pay their wages, the costs of raw materials, overhead, and other expenses required to keep the production process going. As Marx says in Capital, the action of labor power not only reproduces its own value, but produces value over and above it. This surplus value is the difference between the value of the product and the value of the elements consumed in the formation of that product, in other words, of the means of production and the labor power. Furthermore, Engels states in Anti-Düring, to lay bare the essential character of capitalist production, this was done by the discovery of surplus value. It was shown that the appropriation of unpaid labor is the basis of the capitalist mode of production and of the exploitation of the worker that occurs under it. That even if the capitalist buys the labor power of his laborer at its full value as a commodity on the market, he yet extracts more value from it than he paid for, and that, in the ultimate analysis, this surplus value forms those sums of value from which are heaped up the constantly increasing masses of capital in the hands of the possessing classes. The genesis of capitalist production and the production of capital were both explained. Now, since we just mentioned capital, what exactly is capital? The Marxist definition of capital is the wealth, including not only money, but more essentially also land, buildings, machinery, and hard labor, that is devoted to the production of more wealth. The capitalist hires workers who make practical use of that existing capital, be it factories, machinery, raw materials, etc., to create additional value, so-called surplus value that we already defined, which then automatically belongs to the capitalist. This retained surplus value becomes part of the expanded capital that the capitalist then owns. If an ordinary person like yourself has some money saved up or still some left over at the end of the month, that is not necessarily capital. The reason is that the worker has no way of making use of that money to create more value, more capital. You as a worker do not own a factory, machinery, the necessary raw materials, etc. that would allow you to do that. On the other hand, even if a capitalist is deeply in debt and needs to borrow more money to keep functioning, if he already owns a factory, machinery, raw materials, and purchases labor power, meaning hires workers, he already has a tremendous amount of capital and is in a position to make use of it to generate additional capital, unlike you. Money can be used as capital, for example, to build factories, buy machinery and raw materials, hire workers, etc. But it must be kept in mind, when money is used in this way, it is usually referred to as money capital, as in a specific form of capital. But if money, whether small amounts or large amounts, is not used for such purposes, it is not capital. To quote a fun little passage from Marx's Capital, capital is dead labor that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. Very kinky. The idea being expressed here is that the capitalists, through their ownership of capital, which came from the previous exploitation of workers, are thereby in a position to further exploit workers. Speaking of which, several other terms that we have mentioned, let's all talk about class and struggle and proletariat and bourgeoisie. Well, to quote Lenin, classes are large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in a historically determined system of social production, by their relations, in most cases fixed and formulated in law, to the means of production, by their role in the social organization of labor, and consequently by the dimensions of the share of social wealth of which they dispose and the mode of acquiring it. Classes are groups of people, one of which can appropriate the labor of another owing to the different places they occupy in a definite system of social economy. In other terms, a class is simply defined by their relations to the means of production. If you own means of production, then you are a member of the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie. If you own no means of production, and as a result must sell your labor power, then you are a member of the proletariat. Now, with that said, what exactly is the proletariat? Well, it is in general terms the working class. The class of people in capitalist society who, deprived of any ownership of the means of production, must sell their labor power to the capitalists in order to survive, as aforementioned. Hence the exploited class in bourgeois society. To quote Engels, by proletariat is meant the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. Now, in contrast, the bourgeoisie are the capitalist class, the ruling class in capitalist society, which owns the means of production, factories, etc., and exploits hired labor. To again quote Engels, by bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production, and employers of wage labor. Now, when discussing the proletariat and bourgeoisie, we enter into the concept of class struggle. Now, class struggle is the struggle between social classes with antagonistic or irreconcilable interests. To quote Marx, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. Now, with those simple definitions out of the way, how about we define the various systems that exist around capitalism? The first being social democracy. So, not to avoid any confusion, in some older texts, for example Lenin's, you'll see references to social democracy when in reality they mean our modern conception of socialism, in the revolutionary and scientific sense. The reason for this is because at the time, the term social democracy was usually used to refer to socialism, until a split in the movement happened, in which one side remained convinced of the necessity of revolution and the abolition of capitalism, those being socialists and communists, and the other side just wanted a tamer, gentler capitalism, that being the ones that self-identify as and are currently referred to as social democrats. In essence, that's the difference. To quote Richard Wolff, and I apologize in advance for the lengthy quote, in the past, social democracy called for using the state to offset, correct, regulate, and otherwise manage the workings of capitalism. It sought a capitalism with a human face, one with fewer inequalities of wealth, income, power, and access to culture. The state was to manage capital investment, regulate markets, and shape the distribution of income and wealth, all in the interest of a society with a deeper and more widely shared sense of community. Economic growth and efficiency attributed to capitalism were to be supported, while state policy would prevent or counteract the socially undesirable consequences of private capitalist production and commodity markets. State interventionist capitalism was the solution. Private capitalism free of state controls and intervention was the problem. The social democratic solution thus constrained what private capitalists could do in their profit-driven competition with one another and their profit-driven relations with employers and customers, but it left them in the position of receiving and dispensing enterprise profits. Social democracy thus left private capitalists with the incentive to weaken, deflect, or remove those constraints. It also provided capitalists with the means, their retained profits, to do so. In a sense, this was the historic capitalist-socialist compromise of the 19th and 20th centuries. Capitalists could keep their positions as receivers and dispensers of enterprise profits, but the conditions of those positions would be constrained by social welfare state policies. Whatever the benefits, this historic compromise set the stage for new struggles. Welfare states became contested terrains. Social democrats sought to strengthen and expand them, while capitalists sought to reduce, weaken, or eliminate them. From gains, the trend moved in the direction that favored capitalists. The trend turned into a route in the 1970s and has remained so ever since. The capitalists used their profits to improve their business prospects and performance by, amongst other strategies, undoing welfare statism. By lobbying, moving production outside national borders, immigration, common markets, media campaigns, and countless other mechanisms, the capitalists succeeded in bringing social democracy to its current sorry state. Even where trade unions and socialist and communist parties were strong, they proved no match for the profits capitalists could use against them. In essence, this was an analysis that was already made by Marx, Engels, Lenin, and other thinkers of the time, and history has proven the social democratic path to be a failed one, especially when it comes to minimizing the power of capitalists and instituting socialism. I go into this further in my video on the problems of the Western left here. Check it out if you're interested. With that said though, what is socialism then? Well, socialism is considered to be an intermediate and transitional form of society between capitalism and communism, characterized in its economic aspect by the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their work, and characterized in its political aspects by the control and rule of society by the revolutionary proletariat and its party or parties. Various policies include the abolition of private property, the suppression of markets, the reorganization of the workplace along democratic lines, public ownership of all means of production, the initiation of economic planning, the elimination of wage labor, and semi-contentiously, cultural revolution. The latter taking the form of fighting reactionary ideology in the party and society as a whole, be it sexism, racism, etc. To remind us, socialism is still a form of class society, where class struggle still exists, and bourgeois and proletarian ideology and tendencies still conflict with one another. Now, this goes a little bit beyond the one-on-one presentation I'm giving here, but the general idea is this. Even after the capitalist system is defeated and socialism is instituted, we'll still have certain remnants of bourgeois ideology within this new fledgling socialist society. And as a result, these different tendencies will need to be fought against. If you're interested in the idea of class struggle continuing into socialism, then I really highly suggest reading Mao's work, because he was the first to really develop that more than just a vague idea. Of course, there's much more nuance to all of this, but again, I'm trying to keep this all simple, so do forgive me. Since that's socialism though, what exactly is communism? Now, communism is a classless, stateless, and moneyless socioeconomic system in which all the means of production are owned and controlled by the people as a whole. The basic economic principle of communist society is from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. Now, how do we go about dismantling capitalism and building socialism? Well, revolution. Revolution is the overthrow of one class by another class, and the subsequent suppression of the overthrown class through limitations on their power and differing forms of capital, be it monetary, social, etc. More concretely, a socialist revolution is the overthrow of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Hopefully this is peaceful, but ruling classes have very rarely given up power when politely asked to. A neat historical tidbit is that quite a few socialist revolutions were relatively bloodless. It was usually the reaction against workers seizing power by former disgruntled capitalists, landlords, monarchists, and their connections abroad that was extremely violent. And I think that's enough for an intro video. I do want to make more of these, so let me know if this was interesting, and I'll make more in-depth videos on specific concepts, as well as just go into other more obscure terms that require definition or explanation. I have reading suggestions for you in the video titled The Only Leftist Reading List You'll Ever Need, which is a semi-joking title, but you can find that here. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. There's a Discord and everything. Go have fun. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to KLE, Marxist 882, DD, Finlay Campbell, Egg Yolk, Eric Botswick, Rowan Wall, Nikolai Stefan, Kimberly Fredericks, Nico Schubert, Big Boto, Snake Max Hyphen, AC, Johnny Rocket, Marshall Iverson, Thomas Grazier, Don C. Rockmore, Curry Spice, Crack Up, Chance Benham, and Nickety Sade. Thanks for watching.